Good morning. My name is Wielgopolan. I work in the Institute of Geophysics, Polish Academy of Sciences. And today we're going to talk about fascinating culture related closely to Arctic region. In fact, I think people already know a lot about them, about Vikings, Northern warriors, as they are described in many books, comic books, movies. Like I showed you, there's a popular TV show dedicated to them, although it's quite violent, so I'm not sure if some of the younger students are even allowed to watch it. I think it's 16 plus. But I'd like to give you some facts, put things in order, and maybe surprise a little bit with debunking some myths. So, Vikings, or the age of Vikings, what is the era that we were talking about? So the period referred to, at least now referred to as the Viking Age, or the Age of Vikings, dates around 800, in the 9th and till mid-11th century, Anno Domini. And the homelands of the Vikings were basically Scandinavia, but the countries of Scandinavia, as we know them today, did not exist until the end of the Viking Age, actually. So Vikings came from 3 countries of today's Scandinavia, which is Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And actually the name Viking comes from a language called Old Norse, and it means a pirate raid. So people who went off raiding in ships were said to be, in Old Norse, were said to be going Viking. While we do not know exactly what they referred to themselves as, the term Vikings is quite new. They did not refer to themselves as Vikings. It's a 19th century phrase. So at the time of the Vikings, this era, other nations referred to them as Norse, Norsemen, or Danes. So Viking voyages, Viking raids are one of the most important feature of this era, and of their culture too. And the Viking Age references have the earliest recorded raid at the end of 8th century, and then until the they continued until the Norman conquest of England in 1066. And during this time, the reach of those Scandinavian people, those Danes, extended to all corners of Northern Europe, and many other nations found Vikings raiding their coasts. So the farthest reported record of Vikings were in Baghdad, but it was not a raid, it was trading for goods like fur, like narwhal tusks, and seal fat. As you could also see in this short piece of TV show, they're mostly depicted as quite brutal warriors. But of course, it wasn't possible to be only a nation of warriors, and actually most Vikings were farmers. And they were excellent in many activities, like they were good handymen, like carpenters, blacksmiths. They were great at bone carving. They were great animal doctors, fence repairers, and so on and so on. So they could do whatever that was needed around the farm. They made lots of complicated tools. They built whatever building they needed for themselves, for their animals. And but when work on the farm slowed down, actually, as an extra activity, Viking farmers might get in a group and go raiding, exploring, or trading, not only killing and burning villages down. And as for trading, which was one of the most important activities. They were trading, like I said, narval tusks. They were trading them as unicorn horns. They were pretending they had magical value. And also, unfortunately, they were not only trading this, but they were also trading people. They were trading slaves they caught during the raids. And the traders went west as far as Newfoundland in the New World, and we're going to get to that, how they get to the New World, to America, and east as far as the Volga River down to Constantinople. So they're really kings of the era, also in terms of the range of their activity, of the training too. So they were very skilled. They were not only brutal murderers, they were also navigators, craftsmen, and their raids were not only warlike, they were also keen on immigration and assimilation with local communities. And in order to perform all those long, adventurous and challenging trips, they had to use boats, of course. And they were experts in boats building, in shipbuilding. Those boats are very, very characteristic. They call them dragon boats or long boats, or they're quite long, obviously, and they also often had this dragon head in the front. So this famous longboat was very easy to steer and landed smoothly on beaches. So it was great for raiding, to come with surprise. They were very big, and they could often hold up to 100 people at the same time. You may know that unlike many ships, Viking boats were open. That is, there's no lower deck, no place for shelter, and it might be very uncomfortable in heavy weather, with risk of hypothermia, of being swamped to the sea. So you had to be really strong to undertake this travel. So, like I said, most of Vikings were not warriors, or not entirely warriors. They were not raiding all the time. They were farmers, and this is a structure of or hierarchy of social society. So there were three main distinct classes. Of course, there were kings, but the three main classes were, well, at the bottom, there were so-called thralls. They were, that means unfree. They were slaves. And slaves had no rights, basically. Where they became too sick or old to work anymore, they were simply put to death. And if a slave was freed, he could gain status of a free man, but still would have a very low status. Many of the slaves came from the Baltic countries and were gathered during raids there, and also were traded. Then there was the Carls or Trolls. They were free men, and that was the majority of people in Norse society. They were free men, they were landowners, and they had a very, probably a life that was typical to the era. Viking girls got married at 12, had to take care of the household, and their husbands were farming or sailing off for adventures. But actually, they had more, in this case, Karl's women had more freedom than other women of the era in other regions. So they could inherit property, request a divorce, and reclaim some goods from the husband. So they weren't considered as owned by husband. And this is much more than many medieval women in other regions could tell. And also there were jarls or earls. Earl, you can know this word because Earl in English is now like a count, like not a princess. It's a noble title in general. They were the wealthiest men. They were rulers, but not kings. Well, they were in general they were considered to be noble. Of course, a very food like language that we're going to get through later, or religion, are a very important part of everyday life and of every culture. So we might imagine that they were eating only meat, maybe raw meat, and just and didn't put too much attention to what they were eating. But actually, the diet wasn't only raw meat. They had their own type of yogurt. They had a lot of vegetables, and they also brought lots of stuff from trading. So, of course, dried fish, meat, reindeer, seals, all that the nature surrounding them could offer. But seaweed also, like algae, very modern food, like porridge, and they were bringing lots of exotic traits from abroad, like peaches, like cinnamon, and they were also producing beer. And where did they live? What did their houses look like? They was very ecological, we might say, in a way, from today's perspective. Their shelters were very eco, very green, literally green. It is so-called langus. Langus is a house, but also house for their domestic animals. They were a little. They were very much similar to their longboats. So there were 5 to 7 meters wide and 15 to 75 meters long. So very, very long. So they were also built like boats. The roof was covered with tarp, and this was for better isolation. And there was only one hole, which was a chimney. So it was quite smoky and dark inside. So people were living together in a house, the entire family, their slaves, often domestic animals, in a stable room like here at one side. What might sound unusual at first is that fact that when Viking died, when they also wanted their long houses, their langus, to die. So they either burned or buried their houses when someone was dying. So this is quite unusual. They want their shelter to disappear with them. I told you that they were green, so because of the turf covering the roof, and they looked like this, very modern eco with high level of energy efficiency. And I'm talking a lot about boats because boats were obviously very important in their everyday lives, in their trading, in their wars, in their raids, but also in their beliefs and their spirituality. How about their beliefs? Well, they believed in many, 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 many gods. They had this mythology, very complicated with lots of legends and stories. And Viking, and especially Viking warriors, did not want to die in bed, because they were afraid that if they die in bed, not in fight, they would go to a foggy underworld called Niflheim. It was much better to die in a battle and go to Valhalla. I'll get to that. So you might have heard or watched in movies that when Viking warrior was buried, it was like this. He was put onto his longboat, and the longboat was lit on fire and pushed to the sea. Well, actually, it wasn't like that, because the boats were too precious for them, and they were rarely burned. But instead, they were preparing sorts of tombs like this one in a shape of a boat. It was symbolizing a longboat of a dead Viking. So sometimes it would happen, but only in case of very, very important jarls, earls, those noble people. Normal warriors were not buried like that. So I told you that there are lots of gods, but also quite complicated mythology with giants, ghosts, even zombies. And yes, zombie is also not only African concept, but also Viking concept, northern concept. It was draug, so-called again walker, dead people walking. I think that you can recognize this image from a movie Thor, about Thor. So this is totally based on the Vikings mythology. So about those gods, the ruler of gods was Odin, and he was god of lots of stuff like magic, like poetry, and also war. He had a wife, Frigg, and they had a son. And Freya was goddess of love and fertility, and wept golden tears when she was unhappy. She had a twin brother, Freyr, and they were also lots of sacred animals related to them. If you remember Thor, this guy here, he was red-headed. He ruled the skies, he ruled the storms and thunder. He had iron gloves and magic belt and a famous hammer. People loved Thor, but there was also Loki, his mischievous brother, Tricker, and he caused the death of the son of Odin, and so on and so on. There was lots of family drama there. And how did they praise their gods? Well, very often through sacrifice, and sacrifice was a way to appease the gods, and the offering could comprise also humans, but animals or objects. And human sacrifices were performed in funerals, at funerals to accompany those the fallen into the next world, and also at religious festivals like Yule and other festivals. They did sacrifice humans. Actually, this Odin, the biggest Norse god, was also associated not only with magic and poetry, but also with hanging and strangulation. And it is believed that Vikings used those methods when they wanted to make an offering, a human offering to Odin. I mentioned that they were afraid to go to. I'll show you that. I think it's here. They were afraid to go to Nilfheim. I'll get to that in a second. But they really wanted, at least warriors wanted to go to Valhalla. And Valhalla was believed to be warriors' paradise, the whole of the Poland. So according to the Old Norse poem, you might say it, the Valhalla is made of shields, has spears, and it's basically a warrior's paradise, really. It's guarded by wolves and eagles, and the dead who reside in this paradise, in Valhalla, live a life that would be an envy of any Viking warrior. All day long they fight one another. That was their idea of paradise. Doing countless valorous deeds along the way. All their wounds are healed, they are restored to full health, and can have a never-ending battle again. And those who die of sickness or old age find themselves in hell. Sounds familiar? Yes, hell, like hell, the bad place downstairs. So we borrowed a lot from Vikings, actually. Okay, I already mentioned that they didn't actually, that this burying-related myth isn't true. They didn't actually burn their longboats all the time, but we can still find those symbolic graves in shape of longbows. So Nilfheim, hell, sounds familiar? Well, it's a famous Yggdrasil, and Yggdrasil is a tree of life. So according to Vikings, this is the world, and there are 9 underworlds adjusted to tree of life, adjusted to Yggdrasil. It's actually an interesting concept of many dimensions, maybe. Okay, so were they really so bad? Because as you could also see in this short part of TV series, they always depicted, and the first thing that comes to our mind is that they're brutal, very, very brutal. They want this to kill. They're very cruel and bloodthirsty. They're ruthless. So were they brutal? Yes, and almost as brutal as shown in those books and shows in Hollywood, etc. And towards other people, whether as brutal, well, that's not so clear, because they were also brutal amongst themselves. That means amongst different tribes, let's say. So it's mostly the brutality of their time. So this is the image, and I will show you in a minute why it is incorrect in at least one way. This is the image that we have of the Viking, but actually, like I said, most of them would probably look like this, like regular farmers, maybe sometimes going on a raid or two or trading. But brutality of their time, remember, the Viking era ends at the beginning of 11th century. So it's so these are Middle Ages, and the world is very, very dark. It's a dark place in many ways, and the brutality is actually everywhere. Death is everywhere. Diseases are everywhere. Humanity has lost of its achievements from Roman Empire, and it's all going very well. The science is not on a very top level. So everybody was behaving well. There was no such thing as concept of human rights or value of human life. Slavery was everywhere. So then if a lot of people were doing such things at the time, why are the Norse, the Nordics, the Danes are the only ones who are depicted that way in our times? Because, well, for many reasons. First of all, because the land they invaded still have their influence. We saw some influence in language, and we'll see more later. And some of these lands were big achievements of exploration, and they did this exploration and those raids for a very long time, at least 3 centuries. So it is well noted. And well, their culture was quite brutal also, like I said, among themselves. So it's not that only were killing outsiders. But what do you think? Why is it that they're depicted as a very, very brutal? Well, there's one very particular reason. They were raiding mostly monasteries, priests, because monasteries were rich and were not so well protected and were close to the coast. So their first very well-known raid was in a monastery in England, and of course those were brutal raids, and priests, monks were the only ones who could write at the time mostly. So they couldn't possibly describe them in a different way than as apocalypse, as the most ruthless of all. And probably they were not more brutal than other groups, but actually because they attacked mostly priests who were able to give this those written testimonies, it was like that. But here, as you can see, they look quite innocent. And actually, even from this TV show again, when we think about Vikings, we often tend to think of them being very tall, very violent, and very dirty. And what did they actually look like? Well, the interesting fact is that in the Viking age, the facial features of men and women were more alike than they are today. So now we are more different. There are more facial differences between men and women. And in Vikings area, women were more masculine and men had more feminine faces than today, with less prominent jaw, less brow ridges actually. There were in fact two dominant hair colors in Viking society, which is blonde hair and red hair. They were not as tall and gigantic as depicted because the conditions were hard, the food was scarce, and they were probably at least 10 centimeters shorter than now average height of a human being. But still, they were quite tall for their era. And again, were they really dirty? Well, like I said, the early Middle Ages are not the best time for many things, hygiene and sanitary conditions included. So this is the myth that we have from this image here. But evidence suggests that Vikings actually had very good personal hygiene and were very well groomed. They were, well, excavators found that Vikings had grooming tools for their birds, for their hair, that they were most commonly used by Vikings. Like they had tweezers, combs, nail cleaners, ear cleaners, toothpicks from the Viking age, and it was a common tool for them. For example, in what is modern day Finland, archaeologists have found and dated to Viking age saunas used to bath. So they were building and using saunas for cleaning, and they had bathing rituals, combing rituals, and so on and so on. And just in today's society, or maybe not, the being blonde, I said that blonde and red were the most common hair colors, and being blonde was considered to be highly desired. So they had tactics to lighten their hair and their birds, using like strong soap to bleach their hair in a less developed way than today, but still they were, well, at least putting as much effort as they wanted to dye their hair to be more blonde. And one of the images that was in comic books and all the way, actually, lately I was at a Halloween party, and there was a guy who was disguised as a Viking, and he was wearing this kind of horned helmet, and I was like, but you know that it's not true, they did not look like that. So this popular image of Viking in horned helmet dates back not to Viking era, it dates back to 19th century. So it was created by Scandinavian artists, like many artists, but Sweden's Gustav Malmström, who included this horned helmet in the portrayal of Viking. When, for example, when Richard Wagner staged his Ring of Nibelungs opera in the 19th century, in 1970s, the costume designer created this horned helmet. So they were never actually wearing this, But the costume designers wanted them to look more dangerous, more devil-like, so they added those horns. So remember, if you ever see a costume of a Viking with horned helmet, it's actually more like a costume from the Wagner opera, not from the actual Viking era. As for the spirituality connected with their language, actually, this is their alphabet, runes. But runes were much more than alphabet. They were sacred. They were a tool for magic, and each rune had a name and had a significance. Like, for example, this rune Algis, like this, was a protection against bad ghosts. And the runes were used everywhere. They had those special rock totems that were all covered with runes for protection, mostly for praising gods, for magical reasons. I mentioned that they were raiding monasteries mostly, and this is the reason why they're depicted as the most brutal of their time. Actually, the first ever attack ever recorded was in 793. Vikings attacked the Christian monastery in Lindisfarne. They were pagans from European point of view, not Christians, like most people in Britain. So a Viking robber did not think twice about robbing a Christian church, and of course, Christian monasteries were easy to attack. They had no weapons, and they kept valuable treasures: gold, jewels, books, food, drink, cattle. So everything was very tempting for greedy Vikings. And you can see the real image: no horns on their helmets. Do you know any famous Vikings? If you're 16 plus and you watched this TV series I showed you, you might remember this one, Ragnar Lodbrok, for example. And if you followed my lesson dedicated to Greenland, you may remember Eric the Red. So let's start with Lodbrok. Ragnar Lodbrok. Lodbrok means hairy pants, actually, pants with hair. Ragnar Lodbrok became known when he was very young. At 15 years old, he killed an entire brood of snakes and to win a hand of a girl. And after that, he built his Viking career, raiding the coasts of France. Actually, he was even paid by a French king to not raid his town. So this is how feared he was. People paid him not to attack them. This is like a very modern type of crime too. Unfortunately, for all this, his snake killing, raiding, that once made Ragnar Lodbrok very famous and seemingly indestructible, became his eventual sad end, his doom. He had another raid on England, an unsuccessful one. He was captured and, of course, executed in a brutal Middle Ages medieval way by being thrown into a pit of poisonous snakes. So this is how his fame began. That then his life ended in a similar way. And you might notice this famous Viking as well, Leif Erikson. Why should he be famous at least? Well, probably because he sort of discovered America. I know we think that Christopher Columbus did it, but nearly 500 years before the birth of Christopher Columbus, a band European sailors left their homeland in search of new world. They had those longboats, fast and indestructible, They were traversing unfamiliar waters, and they came to a land. They dropped anchor, went ashore. And this happened to be here, in the northern parts of America. So this is how as far as they got. So they could be the first European ones to ever touch North American soil, 500 before Christopher Columbus was even born. So the guy who was chief of this band was Leif Erikson, who was actually son of Erik the Red, who founded the first European settlement of Greenland after being expelled from Iceland for killing. So another brutal story. So Erikson was also an adventurous type. And Icelandic legends called sagas talk about Erikson's exploits in the New World around year 1000. And so this is probably where they got was probably the present day Canada, and Erikson gave a name to those surroundings that he came to. It was Helluland, and because he found these surroundings the environment very boring, he called it Stone Slab Land. And the Vikings spent entire winter there, and because the weather comparing to their homeland was not so cold, not so bad, they explored the surrounding region, and they simply sailed home to Greenland actually, and yeah, that was a story. But this is not only a saga, because archaeologists have discovered evidence that supports the saga stories that the Norse really did exploit North America. So they were way ahead. So let's end with some fun facts related to Vikings. Some of them you may know, and some may be new to you. First of all, days of the week, at least in English, are named after Viking gods. So maybe it's not clear when you look at them at first, but this is how it is. Odin, the god of all gods in Norse mythology, was otherwise known as Woden, and gives us Wednesday, literally Woden's Day. You have Thor, the one with the hammer. There's Thursday, literally Thor's Day. So we owe them at least English names of some days of the week. And other words too, like anger, skull, knife, die, well, come from Old Norse, from Vikings language. And the choice of words that were absorbed by English language actually tells us a lot about how we perceive Vikings. Also, there's this word berserk, going berserk, often used in English to describe when somebody is going totally crazy. And this comes from the word berserkers, and they were type of Viking warriors who absolutely terrified those who they raided. You see the image of one of the berserker. They were wearing animal skins, howling like wild animals. So when someone goes berserk, that means someone goes crazy and terrifying like this. They were. I already mentioned that some Vikings were paid not to raid some countries by a king of France, for example. But in some cases, some emperors, some kings, hiring them as guards, as for example, a Byzantine, which means Eastern Roman Emperor. They harangue Viking warriors, calling them Varangian guards. And some gross stuff, but very practical too. Have you ever wondered how they were able to start fire, especially in a battle when there was no time to tear one stick to another, with no matches, of course, no lighters? Well, to start fires, the Vikings used a type of fungus, mushroom, let's say, which was it's found in Europe, North America, Asia too, and it was boiled actually with human urine. So they were using the pee as fire started, and it was causing a very fast and blowing fire. But like I said, the battle was very important for them, but it wasn't the center of their life for the whole community. They were having fun too, not only raiding monasteries. They were practicing skiing for fun. This is something that archaeologists found. Ski boots with a ski. They even had a god of skiing, whose name was Ur, and they worshipped him. And so this is something that they were doing for fun. They were using the snow around them, at least in the area where there was plenty of snow. But actually, they had a great influence not only on language, on culture, but on environment as well. They altered their landscape, and actually it's the landscape of Iceland. And they caused what we might call the big ecological catastrophe. They altered the landscape by deforestation. They were cutting down forests for their famous longboats, for their famous raiding ships, also for their houses, but for their ships mostly. So they cut down lots of wood, lots of forests, and it still has consequences because they accidentally built the largest desert in Europe. Because the consequences were and are very serious, because the vegetation wasn't able to thrive anymore, and there was no possibility to do farming, grazing in many parts of the country. So there was lack of trees. There was lots of volcanic rock, lots of volcanic ash in the Iceland because it's a volcanic island, and that led to severe soil erosion. With no trees, with no forests keeping soil together, there's a severe soil erosion. So to this day, we have this this effect, this landscape in Iceland. So thank you very much for your attention.